All right. So in general, our choices for housing is to either you can buy a home or you can rent. Um, in terms of types of housing, this book takes a look at what you have a choice of. A single family unit is just that. It's a home where nothing is attached to it. It may be a garage. It's on its own piece of property, and so there's some privacy. And of course, you may have neighbors, but they're not, um, attached to your house, right? So, single-family homes have been most common, and a lot of you might live in a single-family home right now. But that's not the only choice, although it has been the preferred choice. You have your own yard and a lot of maintenance and upkeep to do for your house. You can purchase a condominium. Condominiums are interesting because there's really two parts to it that you kind of need to know. You become an owner of the unit that you're buying, but you also become a general owner in everything that's there. So let's take a gamble that there's a condominium complex near where you live, or you've passed by a condominium complex before. You'll see that each owner has their own individual apartment or townhouse. A townhouse is an up and down unit, 2 floors, sometimes with a basement, but you're right on top of each other. You just have neighbors on either side, not above you or below you. And then there's apartment style or garden style condominiums where it's basically an apartment building where you're going to have neighbors to the left and the right, up and down, depending on what floor you're on. Either way, you own in a condominium, you own your particular unit that you live in. But you're also a partial owner in everything that the association owns. So the piece of land that all those houses are on, the streets and the light poles, and I mean you're and the shrubbery. I mean you own a little bit of everything. And in a condominium association, you also own parts of the buildings, all the buildings, not just the one building that your condo or townhouse is part of. You actually own a portion of all of them. And so for a condominium, it's complex because you're buying an individual unit, but you're also becoming part of what we call a homeowners association, which is a group of owners who own everything. So there's actually going to be two things. You might have your mortgage to pay on your condominium, your individual loan that you took to buy the condo, but you're also going to have something called a homeowners association fee. And that is because you are part of the association of everything, the owner of everything. So you're literally responsible with all the other owners for everything that happens on the property. And so there's going to be additional fees for you if you have a condominium. Okay. A cooperative is a very interesting situation. There's not a lot of cooperatives around, but there actually are a couple in Poughkeepsie if you live in this area. But cooperatives basically look like condominium complexes, but they work different. In a co-op, it's actually a corporation that owns everything. And you buy shares of the corporation that gives you the right to use and live in a certain unit. But as a shareholder in the corporation, because the corporation owns all the buildings and technically owns all the property, you're also responsible for everything that happens in total in a co-op situation, very much like a condo. Except a co-op is a corporation that you become a shareholder in. Condominiums are homeowners associations that are not corporations.
Now I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we have a POA down south. Is there any difference between the homeowners and property owner association?
There shouldn't be, no.
Okay.
There really shouldn't.
Same thing, just a different name.
Yeah, just a different name. Yeah, homeowner association, property owners should be exactly the same, Adam. So again, in that sense, you own your particular unit that you live in, but you also own a percentage of everything on the property. Okay, so if you live in, ancient gardens, complex, well, you own your particular unit within ancient gardens, but you also own a little bit of everything as a homeowner or a property owner. So you have lots of responsibilities, even though it might look like in a condo or in a co-op, you actually have less. You actually have the same. And then, of course, there are rental units. Now, a lot of people like to look at housing as an investment. I would highly recommend that you don't look at housing that way, because you need to live somewhere. You need a home. You're going to be on the planet for some time, and you need a home. And so this is important. I mean, I learned this lesson when I lived in Boston. I lived in a two-story. I was lucky enough to have a two-story home there that I was renting, and the landlord lived above. And this was at a time in the 80s and 90s where prices for housing, particularly in Boston, were skyrocketing. And there'd be a lot of people coming to his door. His name was George, and knock on his door, says, "George, I'd like to make an offer to buy your house." And he had the perfect answer. He said, "Well, if you buy my house, where am I going to live?" And ultimately, that's the purpose of housing. You need a home. You need a place to call home. If it appreciates over time in values, that's terrific, but you still need a home. You need a home when you're born, you need a home when you're growing, you need a home before you pass. So you need a home. A house should not be looked at as an investment. A house should be looked at as a home. And I think a lot of people make that mistake of looking at housing as an investment, when in fact you need a place to live. A place to live. That's the bottom line. As such, there's nothing wrong with renting. There's absolutely nothing wrong with renting. It might be beneficial for some folks to rent because they might not necessarily know the area. So when I moved to New York in 2012 to become the head of the department, I had no idea where Poughkeepsie was before I had this interview. And I had no idea about any of the neighborhoods in Dutchess County, Ulster County, anything that's close by. So the last thing I wanted to do is buy anything. And I also think that, so I rented, and I've been renting. Why I continue to rent now after 8 years is because of the other costs that are associated with housing in New York, that I will explain when I show you a couple of news articles a little bit more. But there are a lot of costs. There's always a cost. Just because you own a house doesn't mean at one point in time you stop paying for anything that's associated with the house. You're always going to have expenses in your budget for housing from the time you get an apartment or a house to the time that that's over. Okay. And even when you retire at some point in the future, it's not like your housing costs go away. You still have housing costs, and I'll explain exactly what that is in one of the slides that I'm going to show you. So it's not, you're always going to have money that you need to throw into housing. It's just a matter of how much you want to spend there. Very much like the question I gave you on the automobile, right? You're going to need to have many different automobiles through your lifetime. How much do you want to spend? Housing is very similar. You're always going to need to have a place to live, and there's always going to be a cost to it, whether you rent or own. There's always going to be costs that are involved. And I think a lot of people look at ownership as saying, well, eventually I won't have any more costs. No, you will. You'll always have costs. You might not have a mortgage, but you'll always have costs. And so that's one of those types of issues that come up in a lot of people's thinking. It's certainly in my thinking, in New York. It was much cheaper for me. I've owned 4 houses, all in Massachusetts, where I'm originally from. It's actually, even though it's jokingly called Taxachusetts, it's actually a better place to buy a house than in New York because of the amount of associated costs that go with home ownership. They're much lower in Massachusetts than they are here. And so so those are your choices. You need a house, and your choices are you can buy it or you can rent it. I will also share with you what's not in the book, the Arujo Rule for housing. The Arujo Rule for housing in general is you should use every room in your house every day. If you have rooms in your house that you're not using, you have too big of a house. And if you have too big of a house, you're paying for all that. Is that really how you want to use your hard-earned money? So you can have like a 3-bedroom apartment, and you can set up one as your regular bedroom and the other as an office, and then another as a guest room or just a space. Well, believe it or not, you're paying for that space even though you're not using it. And so I'll go back to the rule of using every room in your house every day. That should be sort of the guide. You should be buying and renting what you need, not what you don't, because there's a cost to it. And that cost is infinite. It goes on for a number of years while you live there. Obviously, renting a 3-bedroom costs more than renting a 2-bedroom. But if you're not using that 3rd bedroom, it doesn't make any sense to do that. If you buy a house with 3 bedrooms, it's going to cost you more than a house with 2 bedrooms. If you're not using that other room, you're still paying for it. You're still paying for it. So it only makes sense to think about exactly what we need in housing before we actually decide what to do. Okay. One of the other reasons renting an apartment is reasonable is it gives you a lot of flexibility. You only have to sign, most places you only have to sign a lease for a year, which means that if something came up, and particularly when you're young or you have these opportunities for jobs, my stepdaughter just moved out to California. She was in New York. She was renting. She had that flexibility. If I owned a property, and one of my friends owned a property, when he got a job in Texas, this property was in Massachusetts where we grew up. Well, he owned that house and had to pay for that house for almost a year after he moved to Texas because it wasn't selling. So just because you don't live in a house, if you own it, you still got to pay for everything. And that cost him a lot of money over time, because it took almost a year to sell that house. And for that year, he had to pay for everything to make sure the house was okay. So it's one of those types of things where rent gives you that flexibility. You can also break a lease if you have a landlord that's nice enough to say, okay, give me a couple of months rent and get the hell out of here. That's a possibility. It's really up to you and the landlord. And so, that gives you a lot of flexibility. Renting really means that when you find a place to live, you're going to need usually your first month's rent and a security deposit, which usually equals another month's rent. That's usually all you need to, normally speaking, to rent an apartment, other than a good credit score, a job, basic stuff like that. But in terms of cash up front, it's relatively low. So if you pay $1,500 a month for rent, then with $3,000 up front, you can probably get another apartment. Well, that's not true with a house. You're not going to be able to buy much of a house with $3,000 down. In many cases, the way if you want to avoid additional costs, a down payment for a house is often 20%. Now, there are some programs, the VA, FHA, there are some programs that allow you to put much less than that, 5%, 3% down on a house to buy one for certain programs. But for the most part, it takes a lot of time and effort to build up a down payment for a house. It doesn't take as much time and effort to build up a down payment for renting a place. Again, renting is a good option if you're unsettled, if you're not really sure you're going to be in a particular job for too long, or that there might be opportunities in other places where you might need to pick up and leave. And obviously, owning a house doesn't make a lot of sense because you own it. Like what happened to my friend, even though he got a great job in Dallas and he had to move from Massachusetts, he still owned property and it was his responsibility until it was sold. It cost him a lot of money. One of the things that if you own a home, anything that happens to that home is your problem. A pipe breaks, appliances break, anything that happens on the property is the owner's problem. Well, if you're renting, you don't have that type of responsibility to maintain certain things unless that's part of your agreement for the lease. So one of the reasons that I rent as well is I don't like shoveling snow. I don't like doing cutting the grass and maintaining the trees. And I don't get into any of that stuff. And so I'm past that. So as a renter, I don't have any of those responsibilities. That is something that the landlord takes care of as part of the agreement. And that works fine for some folks like myself. The prices of homes are relatively high. In New York, in our area, depending on the town and city that you live in, it could be $250,000. It could be $300,000 or $400,000 for a house. They're very, very expensive to buy a house. So you have to put a down payment, plus you got a big loan to pay back over a long time. And so that may not be attractive to a lot of people. With renting, of course, you don't have that large loan. Okay. And so basically speaking, there are some good reasons to rent. And again, I just shared with you a couple of my reasons, personally speaking, why I still rent in New York.
I think more importantly is not having to worry about a hot water heater, a furnace, a refrigerator going, all those added expenses that you just have no idea when they're going to go. And then
when they go, they're the problem of the owner.
Yeah.
So if you are the owner, it's your problem. If you are a renter, well, of course, you want to make sure your landlord is a good owner. So even when you sit down to look at apartments for rent, you want to make sure you're sizing up that person and say, is this person going to be responsible where if something does happen, they're going to respond right away? Because ultimately that's going to matter in the quality of your experience as a renter. I've been very fortunate to have many, many very good landlords over the years. But I've had some that are not responsive, and it's frustrating. So then you just rent somewhere else. You live out the lease and you go, and so that's always an option. There's something called the rent ratio, the amount of your average monthly salary that's going to be eaten up in rent. You want to make sure everything can fit into things under 30%. The lower, the better. But that 30% is like the max. And that's not just rent. It's everything else that is part of it. What else is part of the cost of housing? Well, in addition to your rent, you got to pay utilities. Some utilities are not included in the rent. What are the biggest expenses you have for utilities? Well, it depends. You need two things. We live in the Northeast. You need heat. because it gets cold, okay? So you need heat for your house. And you also need hot water. We cannot exist these days without hot water. And the only way we get heat and hot water is through energy, and energy costs money. So the type of energy the house has is important. If it's electric, it could be gas, it could be oil. Gas and oil are pretty common in the Northeast. And so again, you're paying for the price of energy because you need heat for your house. You're paying the price of energy because you need hot water for your house. Heat and hot water are the biggest things you're going to be spending your money on regarding energy most of the year. The other part of the year, of course, air conditioning. If you have, we live in an area that gets pretty hot in the summertime. A lot of people need AC. That costs money to run all day. Okay, so the type of energy that you're purchasing to run that AC is important. That's going to be part of your rent ratio. Okay. A lot of renters have to pay other utilities. They have to pay for their own water and sewer bills. They have to pay for trash. And some renters are required to have renter's insurance. So that's another expense. That's part of housing. So all those things are important to keep in mind. It's not just the amount of rent. It's everything else, that's not included in the rent. That's part of your housing costs. It's, of course, worse for owners, as Adam was suggesting earlier, because renters don't have to pay something called property taxes. And property taxes are the main way your local government gets its resources to carry out its mission of public education and public safety, police, fire, etc. They rely on property owners to pay a tax. That's called property tax. In New York, it's broken into land tax and school tax. And those taxes never, ever, ever go away for owners. Okay? Whether you're working or not working, whether you're young or retired and very old, you're still paying taxes on your property. As a renter, you're not paying the tax. A portion of your rent is going to the landlord, who then has to pay the tax. So the property tax is going to get paid one way or the other, but it's part of the rent that you pay to your landlord. Okay, it's covered that way. Home ownership, again, I think it's overblown. My honest opinion. Like I said, I've owned 4 homes, all in Massachusetts. That's always been pushed as part of the American dream. But I think that it's interesting when you look at the businesses that are involved in home ownership. So you have a builder. There's not a lot of land to build houses on. There's so many regulations, environmental protection, other types of restrictions on land use, that there's just not a lot of land that is available to build new homes. So once a piece of land becomes available and you are a builder, a developer, builder, you're going to put as many large homes on the property as possible, because large homes sell for lots of money. And you are a business, you're a real estate developer, and that's your business. You want to make a profit, you want to make a lot of profit. So what that does is much of the housing stock that's been built since, I would say since the 90s, but certainly since 2000, has been these mega mansions, right? Or these mini mansions, but they're big ass houses. Look around. Any of the new houses that you see, they're not small, they're big, really big. And that's because, like I was saying, there's not a lot of land to develop. And so if you're a real estate developer and you get your hands on a piece of land and you can develop that into homes, you're going to build the biggest homes you can at the highest prices that you can. And that's what we've seen go on in the area. Unfortunately, we live in a market economy, which means that When housing prices start to take off because people are buying bigger homes, then the smaller homes now can command a higher price. Because in a market economy, housing, one part of the housing sector is going to affect all the other ones. So if now we're building houses that are 3, 4, 500,000, that means that my little $100,000 house, I can actually probably get 150 for, or maybe 200. Because look at what people are buying. They're willing to pay $500,000 for a house. So my house is worth more now too, because of the market. That's part of the problem with the market economy with housing, is it drives all prices higher when there's a limited amount of housing that can be built, and they build the big houses that are very expensive. It affects everybody in the community, believe it or not, because of how the market economy works. So we have a lot of older people that have owned houses for years. They might have bought a house 40 years ago. My dad, when we first bought, he bought his very first house. It was only like $17,000 for the house. He didn't know that 30 years later, the house would be worth $200,000. He didn't know that. He bought a $17,000 house. That's all he knew. Okay. He wasn't looking at the house as investment because you need a home. You need a place to live. So it's important to kind of think of that in this regard. So think about the fact that people are, people bought homes for many years ago, and now their homes are worth a lot more today. Well, remember that issue I mentioned about property taxes. Property taxes are usually assigned on a yearly basis based on the value of your home, called an assessed value. So if over time that $14,000 or $15,000 home became a $100,000 home, became a $200,000 home, imagine how much more you're paying in property taxes because of the increase in the value of your home over time. That's why a lot of these older people are, they protest any type of tax increase, because much of what they're living on, they've already seen their property taxes increase a lot. They don't want to pay other types of taxes. And so you have this huge revolt, particularly in the older community, of saying, we don't want to pay taxes. What do they do? Because sometimes you can't fight that. They move out of the area. They go to a cheaper area. My parents moved to South Carolina, where it was a lot cheaper than living in Massachusetts, now that they're retired. Even the property taxes are significantly cheaper. And so they upped and left. And you see that. You see a lot of people in the Northeast, once they get older, they might have lived here for 30, 40 years. They say, we can't afford to live here anymore. Not because they don't make a living, and they may not have a retirement benefit. It's just because they own a house. And that house is costing them more and more and more every year. It's like, what the heck? Right? So they just sell it and they move to Florida, or they move to the Carolinas, or they go somewhere else where it's cheaper. They don't want to be in a high cost area. So again, I say home ownership, a lot of people look at it as the American dream. It's the greatest thing in the world. Okay, tell that to a lot of people who've been here for 40 years that are paying, that their house value went up, which is nice, but they're paying a lot more out of pocket to be in that house. It hurts financially. One of the good things is that there are some tax savings, because you have a mortgage on a house. When you buy a house, you get a loan. It's hard to have a couple $100,000 hanging out in your pocket to buy a house. So usually put something down and you borrow the rest. And that loan is called a mortgage. And you pay interest on that loan, and the interest can be deducted from your federal taxes. Also, the property taxes that you pay on your house can also be deducted from your federal taxes. Unfortunately, with the tax reform that happened under President Trump a couple of years ago, they limited the amount of property taxes and mortgage you can deduct to $10,000. And that hurts people in the Northeast and people on the West Coast, because the housing costs here are high. the property taxes here are high. So putting a limit on how much we can write off means we're paying more taxes federally. And that sucks. Okay. Of course, buying and owning a home, meaning you want to be there for a long time. You don't, if you're looking for a stable place to live for the next 20 years, purchasing a home certainly might be a very good idea. Okay. So that's one of those things your book will talk about. The cost of home ownership is really important to look at, because when you buy a home, you need a down payment. Like I said, most of the time they're looking for, traditionally, we've been putting down 20%. But as you see, 20% down on a $300,000 house, which is typical in this area, right, is $60,000. It's not like you can't cough up 60 grand easily. It takes a long time to get there. So down payments are, a disadvantage to home ownership. A lot of people are looking to put less down because saving $60,000 is difficult to do. Well, banks go on something called a loan to value ratio of 80 to 20. They're looking at, they'll put up 80% of the value of a house as a loan. You put up 20% as a down payment. If they have to put up more than 80% of the amount of the house, they charge you what they call mortgage insurance, which is basically an insurance policy that you pay to guarantee the bank will get its money back. Okay. So it's basically an insurance policy that helps the bank. It's an extra cost for you, and it does absolutely nothing for you. But it is something that's realistic today because of the prices of housing are very high. And coming up with 20% down payment is quite a heavy lift for a lot of people. So they will put 5% or 10% down on a house and borrow 90%. Well, they're going to be paying mortgage insurance. Again, that extra cost to guarantee the bank will not lose money on the loan. You can use part of your retirement account, something called an IRA, to buy your first home. I wouldn't do that, but a lot of people would and have borrowed money from their retirement to buy a house. The reason I wouldn't do that is because I don't think you want to be working when you're 80 years old. So saving for retirement is critical. So borrowing from retirement means you're going to have less debt. So if you want to be very poor when you're 80, that's versus just regular. Borrowing from retirement to buy things now is dangerous in general because it sets you up for more poverty when you're older, when you can least tolerate it, to be honest. The mortgage insurance I've already talked to you about. When you get a mortgage, you borrow money from the bank or a mortgage. There's a bunch of mortgage lenders that are really technically not banks. And basically they charge what they call points, fees to get the loan. So it's just an upfront cost. It's a fee that you're paying upfront to get a loan. It's a pain in the behind. And then, of course, once you decide to buy a home and you've put a down payment down and all this other stuff, you're going to take ownership of that house. That process is part of what we call closing the deal, where the old owner of the house and their legal representatives sign papers over to you as the new owner of the house. You sign papers saying that, you sign papers with the bank, you sign papers up the yin yang that day, and you pay up front certain things, and those are closing costs. Okay, affordability. This is from CNBC. This shows basically how much home you can afford based on your income. It's all taken as part of a monthly gross income. Okay, monthly gross income. Normally speaking, they would not, they look at, actually, I'm surprised this is 29%. It's usually 27% of your gross income as the amount that you can pay for your mortgage, the actual loan on the house. With all the other expenses, it shouldn't exceed 40% of your total monthly income for housing. Okay. And so this chart here shows that someone who makes $40,000 a year, meaning they make about $3,333 a month, can afford basically a mortgage of $967 per month, including all the other stuff, taxes and insurance, no more than $1,367 a month for all of their housing related costs. So it's like a low and a high. Okay. Again, don't exceed again, your book says 30%. I've seen them as low as 27. When they look at all the other expenses for a house, no more than 41%. I've actually seen them as high as 43. So it's actually quite a complex formula that the bankers use to figure out things. Again, property taxes and insurance on your property are always going to be part of what you're always going to pay for the rest of your life as a homeowner. Okay, you might not have a mortgage, you might pay the debt off on the house, but you're never, ever, ever going to get rid of the other stuff. Property taxes are going to be with you forever. Insurance is going to be with you forever. Maintenance and repairs are going to be with you forever. Those are just part of home ownership. There are, like in New York City, the interesting thing too is that there are some cities, towns that have certain rules, and states that have certain rules that limit what landlords can charge based on people's incomes and so forth. That is relatively unique to places like New York City. In many instances, there is no type of rent control in much of the country. Okay, just for everyone to know. Okay. We don't have to worry about that process. I do want to look at loans to buy a house. A loan to purchase a house is a mortgage. Okay. Traditionally, we have mortgages that last 30 years, but a 15-year mortgage is compatible. So imagine, again, when you're buying a house, you're taking a loan out for roughly 30 years. It's a monthly payment for 30 years is traditional. Okay. A fixed rate mortgage means that you've agreed on an interest rate for that whole period of time. So for the entire 30-year period, the loan is going to have a 4% interest rate for 30 years. No changes, no nothing. That's a fixed rate, no changes to the interest rate on the loan. But there are other loans that are called adjustable rate mortgages. They're actually called ARMs, adjustable rate mortgage, ARM. They might end up costing you an arm and a leg. So adjustable rate mortgages basically promise a fixed interest rate for a period of time, after which the rate changes. It adjusts. That's the adjustable word. It adjusts every year based on some type of bellwether rate, like the prime rate or something like that. So they usually mean that the adjustable rate mortgages are attractive because the introductory rates tend to be lower than fixed rate mortgages. So if it's a lower rate on a loan, your payment is lower. Or if the payment's the same, you can afford a bigger house. And so that becomes attractive to some people. Let me talk a little bit about some of the players, the business of selling homes. Your real estate brokers make money by a percentage of the sale of the house. The bigger the price of the house, the bigger their income. So obviously they're pushing you into the higher priced homes because they make more money that way. Mortgage brokers, the folks that sell mortgages, make a percentage of the mortgage as part of their fee, part of their income. So obviously they're also interested in pushing you into higher priced homes because the bigger the mortgage you need, the more money they make. So look at the field in real estate as stacked against you, because everyone makes money when you spend more money. So obviously they're going to give you advice to buy a bigger priced house. Okay. Now think about it this way. Usually speaking, you can afford a house that's 3 to 4 times your annual income. What does that mean? If I make $50,000 a year as my income, then the housing prices I normally can afford would be 3 to 4 times that. So somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 is the price of the houses that I can afford, because it's 3 to 4 times my annual income of 50. That's an old way of looking at things, but it still works. So just because you can afford a $200,000 house doesn't mean you should buy one. Because with that $200,000 house versus a $150,000 house, you're going to be paying more. You know, that real estate broker is going to make more on the sale of a $200,000 house than $150,000. The mortgage broker is going to make more giving you a loan on a $200,000 house than one on a $150,000. And you're going to be maxed out. You know, again, you're buying a home. It's not an investment. It's a home. So I think you have to kind of look at this in a little bit of a different, from a business perspective, those are how the businesses are kind of, they're working with you, but they're not necessarily working for you. Right. So having a bank that helps you get a mortgage, the bank is working with you. But that doesn't mean that they're doing things in your best interest. They're doing things in their best interest. The bigger the mortgage, the higher the fees they're going to make. Same thing with the real estate broker. So you got to look at the players who are involved and how they make a living and analyze it from a different way. Of course, your book doesn't say any of this. This is all additional stuff that I'm giving you that's not in the book. Okay. You're just getting the benefit of an old guy, okay, like myself. So getting a traditional mortgage, 30 years, 15 years, is a conventional mortgage because you put 20% down and you're borrowing 80%. If you need to borrow more than 80% of the value of the house, you'll need a special mortgage program. So there's FHA mortgage, there's a VA loan, mortgages. There are first-time home lending homeowners by the states that are in cooperation with certain banks that offer that. So it's possible to buy a home with less than 20% down, but you need to find a special program to do it. And there are plenty of them out there. But just to know that it's possible. It's definitely possible. All right, so I'm going to stop my share. That was my talk today. I hope it was a